My stepdad introduces me as hired help to his business guests, so I showed him what it really cost. My mom married Richard when I was 16. I'm 24 now and still living at home while finishing my master's degree in engineering. Richard owns a chain of hardware stores and acts like he's some big-shot businessman even though he inherited them from his father. When he married Mom, he made this big show of welcoming me as his daughter, but that lasted about 6 months before he started treating me like staff. It started small, asking me to grab his coffee when I walked by the kitchen, or telling me to answer the door when delivery came. Normal stuff that families do for each other. But then it shifted. He'd have his business partners over and introduce me as someone who helps around the house. Not his stepdaughter, not even by my name, just the girl who helps out. When I graduated college, he threw this party supposedly for me, but spent the whole time telling his friends how he was letting me stay in the house in exchange for household work. My own graduation party, and he was acting like I was the maid. Mom tried to correct him once and he said he was just joking, but he kept doing it. At Thanksgiving, his brother asked what I was up to these days, and Richard said I was between jobs, so I was earning my keep by maintaining the house. I was literally in grad school full-time with a teaching assistant position. His brother looked confused when I mentioned my studies, and Richard laughed, saying I like to call my chores studying. The worst was when he had a huge business dinner at the house. 15 of his most important clients and partners. Richard told me and Mom to prepare everything, but Mom had to work late, so it was just me cooking for hours. When the guests arrived, Richard introduced Mom as his wife and me as the help they'd hired for the evening. Not the girl who helps out, the actual hired help. One man tried to tip me. I was standing there in my own home being handed $20 by a stranger who thought I was catering. Richard thought this was hilarious and actually told me to take the money since I'd earned it. His business partner's wife asked where they'd found me because I seemed very professional for someone so young. Richard said they'd found me through a service and I was working out well. That's when I decided if Richard wanted hired help, he'd get exactly that. First, I looked up what actual household staff cost in our area. Private chefs were $150 an hour. Housekeepers were $60. Personal assistants were $80. I started keeping detailed logs of everything I did. Every meal I cooked, every errand I ran, every time I answered his calls or scheduled his appointments because he couldn't figure out his own calendar. 2 weeks of documentation showed I was doing about $5,000 worth of work monthly. Then I printed professional invoices, real ones with an actual business header I created called Household Management Services. Listed every task with industry standard pricing. The first invoice was for $6,000, including overtime and weekend rates. I left it on Richard's desk on a Monday morning. He laughed and showed Mom, saying I was being dramatic as usual. I said nothing but stopped doing anything for him. When he asked where his coffee was, I said my shift hadn't started. When he told me to prep for his poker night, I asked if he'd approved the overtime rate. When he had friends coming over, I handed him a catering quote and said I needed a deposit before I'd start cooking. Mom was confused, but I explained that Richard had been telling everyone I was hired help for 2 years, so I was just making it official. Richard said I was being ridiculous and he wouldn't pay family for normal household things. I agreed completely and said family wouldn't charge, but he'd made it clear I was staff, not family. So this was a business arrangement now. For 3 weeks, Richard kept expecting me to break. But I didn't cook him a single meal. Didn't wash his clothes. Didn't answer when his friends called the house. Didn't set up the dining room for his monthly business dinners. He had to order takeout every night. His laundry piled up until he ran out of clean suits. His office became a disaster because I stopped organizing his papers. Mom started getting frustrated with him because she had to do everything or it didn't get done. Then came his company's anniversary party. Huge event at the house, 50 guests, supposed to be this elegant cocktail thing. Richard told everyone I'd handle the food and service like always. Except I'd given him an estimate for $12,000 for full event service, and he'd refused to sign it. The morning of the party, I left to study at the library. Richard called me 15 times. I turned off my phone after the 16th call and tucked it into my backpack. The library study room had thick walls and a solid door that locked from the inside. I spread my engineering textbooks across the table and opened my laptop. My thesis needed another 12 pages by next week, and I had actual work to do. Right now, 50 people were supposed to arrive at the house in less than 3 hours. Richard had no appetizers prepared, no drinks chilled, no tables set up, and absolutely no idea how to make any of it happen without me. I could picture him standing in the kitchen, staring at the empty counters, finally understanding what $12,000 of event service actually meant. Mom was probably still at work, completely unaware of the disaster waiting at home. Richard had spent 3 weeks ignoring my estimates, laughing at my invoices and telling his friends I'd handle everything like always. Now he was learning what happened when you refused to pay for services you'd already promised to other people. 4 hours later, I finally pulled my phone back out. 47 missed calls, 23 text messages. I scrolled through them slowly, watching Richard's tone shift with each new message. The first 5 were angry, demanding I get home immediately and stop being ridiculous. The next 8 were frustrated, asking where I was and why I wasn't answering. Then came confusion, wondering if something was wrong with my phone. Around message 15, panic started creeping in. By message 20, he was begging. The last 3 messages offered me anything I wanted if I'd just come home right now. One message said he'd pay my full estimate. Another said he'd double it. The final message, sent 6 minutes ago, said the guests were leaving and his business reputation was destroyed. I put the phone face down on the table and went back to my thesis. Mom called 20 minutes later. Her voice sounded tired and embarrassed when I answered. She asked me to please come home, not for Richard, but because she felt terrible about the whole situation. I explained calmly that I'd given Richard a detailed estimate 2 weeks ago, with a clear breakdown of costs and timeline. He'd refused to sign it, refused to take it seriously, and told me I was being dramatic. I'd followed through on exactly what I'd promised, which was nothing without payment. Mom was quiet for a long moment, then admitted she understood, but wished I'd warned her this was coming. I reminded her that I'd tried to explain my position 3 weeks ago when this whole thing started. She'd said Richard would come around eventually. Well, he hadn't, and now here we were. Mom sighed and said she'd see me when I got home later. She didn't ask me to hurry. I arrived home that evening around 8. The house looked like a tornado had hit it. Plastic takeout containers covered every surface in the dining room. The living room had half-empty glasses scattered across tables and the floor. Someone had spilled red wine on the cream carpet near the fireplace. Mom was in the kitchen loading the dishwasher with paper plates. She looked exhausted. I grabbed a trash bag and started collecting empty containers without saying anything. Mom told me what had happened while we cleaned. Richard had tried to order enough Chinese food, pizza, and sandwich platters for 50 people with only 2 hours' notice. Most places laughed at him. The ones that agreed delivered at completely random times over a 3-hour period. Guests arrived at 6 expecting elegant cocktails and appetizers. Instead, they found Richard frantically answering the door for delivery drivers while trying to explain the situation. Some people left within 15 minutes. Others stayed out of politeness but looked increasingly uncomfortable as the evening became more chaotic. Mom said Garrison Ford had been one of the first to leave. He'd pulled Mom aside and asked if everything was okay with the family, because this level of disorganization didn't match Richard's usual professional standards. Several other business partners followed within the hour, making polite excuses about early mornings or prior commitments. Richard had spent the entire evening making desperate apologies and blaming staffing issues. He never once mentioned that he'd refused to hire actual staff or pay for actual services. Mom said she'd tried to help him salvage things, but there was only so much she could do when food kept arriving at wrong times, and guests were standing around with nothing to eat or drink. By 7:30, only a handful of people remained, mostly out of pity. Richard had disappeared into his office around 7:45 and hadn't come out since. Mom looked at me and said she knew I'd made my point, but this was really bad for Richard's business relationships. Richard didn't speak to me for 3 entire days after that. He'd walk past me in the hallway without making eye contact. When we were both in the kitchen, he'd grab what he needed and leave immediately. Mom said he was furious that I'd embarrassed him in front of his most important business contacts. I didn't particularly care. I kept cooking meals for Mom and myself, doing my own laundry and completely ignoring the growing mess in Richard's office and bedroom. His dirty suits piled up in the corner of his room. His desk disappeared under stacks of unfiled papers. The coffee maker stayed dirty because I only cleaned it after I used it. Mom was getting more and more frustrated with him because she was working full-time and didn't have energy to do all his household tasks on top of her own. She started leaving his laundry in the basket instead of washing it. His office stayed a disaster. After 3 days of this, Richard finally realized neither of us was going to break first. Mom sat me down on Thursday evening while Richard was out picking up more takeout. She looked tired, but also kind of relieved. She admitted she'd been frustrated with Richard for years about how he treated me. Every time he introduced me wrong or made some comment about me earning my keep, it had bothered her. She'd tried to correct him quietly, pulling him aside later and asking him to be more respectful. He'd always brushed it off as joking or said I was too sensitive. Mom realized now that she should have been way more forceful about demanding he respect me as actual family. She'd enabled his behavior by quietly compensating for it, doing extra work herself so I wouldn't have to deal with his requests. That had let Richard keep treating me like staff without facing any real consequences. Mom said she was proud of me for finally setting a clear boundary, even though the party disaster had been mortifying. She asked what I actually wanted from this whole situation. Richard finally approached me on Friday afternoon. I was studying at the dining room table when he walked in carrying a printed copy of my original invoice. He set it down in front of me and asked if I was seriously going to charge him $6,000 for 2 weeks of household work. His tone was halfway between angry and desperate. I looked up from my textbook and explained calmly that $6,000 was the industry standard rate for what I'd actually done. Private chef services, personal assistant work, household management, and errand running all had established hourly rates. I'd documented everything carefully and charged exactly what professionals would charge. If he wanted family rates, meaning free, he needed to actually treat me like family instead of hired help. Richard started to argue that families help each other without charging, and I was being petty. I reminded him that he'd spent 2 years telling everyone I was staff, not family, so I was just making our business arrangement official. He'd made his choice when he introduced me as hired help at his business dinner. Now he got to live with that choice. We had our first real conversation right there at the dining room table. I told Richard exactly how his behavior had felt for 2 solid years. Being introduced as someone who helps around the house instead of his stepdaughter. Having him tell people at my own graduation party that I was earning my keep through housework. Listening to him tell his brother I was between jobs when I was actually in grad school full-time. Watching him tell his business partners I was hired catering staff while I stood in my own home being handed tip money. Every single incident had made me feel like I wasn't actually part of this family, just some employee who happened to live here. Richard tried to defend himself, saying it was all just joking around and I was taking things too seriously. I pulled out my phone, opened my voice memos, and played a recording I'd made at Thanksgiving. His own voice came through clearly telling his brother that I was earning my keep by maintaining the house while I liked to call my chores studying. Richard's face went pale as he listened to himself on the recording. The conversation continued for another 30 seconds with him laughing about how I was very dedicated to my housework. When it ended, Richard looked genuinely shocked, like he was hearing his own words for the first time. He started to argue that the recording was taken out of context, that his brother had understood he was joking. Mom walked into the dining room right then and cut him off mid-sentence. She said she'd heard him do this dozens and dozens of times over 2 years and it needed to stop immediately. She'd tried being quiet about it, tried correcting him privately, tried giving him chances to fix it himself. None of that had worked. Now he'd humiliated himself in front of 50 business contacts because he couldn't respect the person who'd been doing thousands of dollars of unpaid work every month. Mom looked at Richard and said he had a choice to make about what kind of family this was going to be. Richard sat there for a long minute without saying anything. Mom stood behind him with her arms crossed, waiting. I could see him trying to figure out how to respond without looking bad. He opened his mouth twice and closed it both times before actually speaking. He said he never meant to make me feel like I wasn't family. I pulled out my notebook with all the documented incidents and slid it across the table. 23 separate occasions over 2 years where he introduced me as staff or help, or someone who worked for him instead of his stepdaughter. Each one dated with witnesses listed. Richard flipped through the pages, getting quieter with each one. Mom leaned over his shoulder and read some of them, her face getting tighter. She pointed at the entry from my graduation party and asked if he really told 8 different people that I was earning my keep through housework. Richard tried to explain that he was just making conversation, that people understood he was joking. I asked him why the joke was always about me being staff and never about me being his stepdaughter in graduate school. He didn't have an answer for that. I told him I didn't actually expect him to pay the invoices, every single dollar of them. What I expected was for him to introduce me correctly from now on, to tell people I was his stepdaughter who was finishing her master's degree in engineering, to stop acting like I was hired help when his friends came over, to treat me like actual family instead of convenient staff who happened to live here. Richard agreed immediately, too fast, like he just wanted the conversation to end. But I could see the anger in his jaw, the way he kept clenching his teeth. He was embarrassed about the anniversary party disaster, and now he was called out with documentation and witnesses. Mom told him this wasn't optional anymore, that she should have insisted on it years ago instead of trying to correct him quietly. Richard stood up and left the room without looking at either of us. The next week, Richard tried to go back to normal like our conversation never happened. I was heading out to campus when he called from the living room asking if I could grab his dry cleaning while I was out. The dry cleaner was 2 blocks from my route, so it seemed reasonable except for the part where we'd just established I wasn't his personal assistant. I walked back to my room and printed out the rate sheet I'd made for errand services. $15 base fee plus mileage and time. Brought it down and handed it to him while he was reading the newspaper. Asked if he wanted to open an account with my business, or if this would be a one-time service. Richard looked at the rate sheet, then at me like I was insane. He said I was being ridiculous about a simple favor. I reminded him that family does favors, but he'd spent 2 years making it clear I was staff, so staff rates applied. Mom walked in right then carrying her work bag and asked what was going on. Richard showed her the rate sheet and said I was charging him $15 to pick up dry cleaning. Mom looked at the paper, looked at Richard, and actually laughed. It surprised both of us because Mom doesn't usually laugh at tense moments. She told Richard to get his own dry cleaning because she was tired of picking it up too. Said she'd been doing it every week for 3 years, and she was done being his errand service. Richard stared at her like she'd just announced she was moving to another country. He realized in that moment that he'd lost both his household helpers at the same time. Mom grabbed her keys and headed for the door, calling back that she'd be home late and he should figure out his own dinner. Richard stood there holding the rate sheet while I picked up my backpack. He asked where I was going, and I said to campus, which was true. He asked when I'd be back, and I said late, also true. Then he stormed past me toward the garage, muttering about handling his own errands since apparently nobody in this house wanted to help family anymore. The irony was completely lost on him. 2 days later, I was studying in my room when I heard Richard on the phone in his office. The walls in this house are thin, and he talks loud when he's upset. He was complaining to someone about how I was being unreasonable and making everything difficult, how I was charging him for basic household tasks and refusing to help with simple things. The other person must have said something because Richard got defensive fast. He said he'd always treated me well, that I had a free place to live and should be grateful. More talking from the other end. Then Richard said something about how his brother didn't understand the situation. I realized he was talking to Alvaro. Alvaro's voice came through faintly, loud enough that I could tell he was disagreeing strongly. Richard tried to interrupt several times, but Alvaro kept talking. Finally, Richard said fine. Maybe he should have introduced me differently at the party, but that didn't justify me embarrassing him in front of 50 guests. More talking from Alvaro, his voice getting louder. Then Richard said he had to go and ended the call abruptly. I heard him slam something on his desk. Sat there for a minute, appreciating that Alvaro had apparently told Richard he brought this on himself, even though I wasn't supposed to be listening to the conversation. 2 weeks after the failed anniversary party, Richard got an email that changed everything. I was in the kitchen making lunch when I heard him yell from his office. Not an angry yell, more like shocked and worried. Mom was at work, so it was just us in the house. He came out holding his phone with this pale look on his face. Showed me an email from Garrison without saying anything at first. The email asked about the staffing situation at Richard's house, and whether there were management issues that might affect their business partnership. Said several of the guests from the anniversary party had expressed concerns about Richard's judgment and professionalism, asked if they needed to discuss the stability of their business relationship going forward. Richard was furious but also clearly scared about his professional reputation taking a hit. He asked if I was happy now that his business partners were questioning him. I pointed out that I didn't send that email, Garrison did. That Garrison formed his own opinion based on watching Richard fail to handle a basic party, because he'd refused to take my estimate seriously. Richard wanted to blame me for the whole situation, but he could see it wasn't going to work. He'd created this mess himself by insisting I'd handle everything while simultaneously refusing to pay for the work or treat me with basic respect. He went back to his office and spent an hour on the phone doing damage control with various business partners. That evening, Mom came home to find Richard stressed and me studying at the dining room table like nothing was wrong. She asked what happened, and Richard showed her the email from Garrison. Mom read it twice, then set the phone down carefully. She said they needed to try family counseling to work through the communication problems. Richard immediately refused, saying they didn't need a stranger involved in family business. This was something they could handle themselves. Mom shook her head and told him this wasn't optional anymore. She'd already called a counselor and made an appointment for next week. Richard tried to argue, but Mom cut him off. Said if he wanted to save his business reputation and his family relationships, he needed to take this seriously. That she was tired of being caught in the middle between his ego and my legitimate complaints. Richard looked shocked that Mom was putting her foot down this hard. He agreed to go, but made it clear he thought the whole thing was unnecessary. Our first counseling session happened on a Tuesday evening at a small office downtown. The counselor was a woman in her 50s who introduced herself and explained how the sessions would work. Richard immediately tried to minimize everything, saying we just had some minor communication issues that got blown out of proportion. The counselor asked him to describe the situation from his perspective. He gave this sanitized version where he sometimes joked around about household help, and I took it too seriously. I waited until he finished, then pulled out my phone with the documented incidents. Read off specific examples with dates and witnesses. The business dinner where Garrison tried to tip me. My graduation party where he told people I was earning my keep through housework. Thanksgiving with Alvaro where he said I was between jobs. The anniversary party disaster. Richard's face got red as I went through each one. The counselor took notes and asked Richard why he felt the need to misrepresent his relationship with me to others. Richard started to give another excuse, but the counselor stopped him. Asked him to really think about the question and answer honestly. We sat in silence for almost a minute before Richard spoke. He admitted he felt like having a stepdaughter in her 20s still living at home made him look unsuccessful. Like he couldn't launch his kids properly or provide well enough for his family. That his business friends all had kids who moved out right after college, and he felt judged for me still being there. The counselor asked why he thought supporting family through graduate school would be seen as failure. Richard didn't have a good answer. Just said it felt that way, especially since he inherited his business instead of building it himself. He already felt like people didn't take him seriously, and having an adult stepdaughter at home made it worse somehow. The counselor pointed out that supporting family through graduate school is actually admirable, not shameful, that most people would see it as being a good parent and provider. Richard looked uncomfortable, like this idea had never occurred to him before. Mom reached over and squeezed his hand, which surprised me. She said she wished he'd told her he felt this way instead of taking it out on me. The counselor turned to me and asked how Richard's behavior had affected me. I explained that I never minded helping around the house when it was framed as family contribution. Cooking dinner or running errands or organizing his office felt fine when it was part of being family. But being introduced as hired help made me feel like I wasn't really part of the family at all. Like I was just some employee who happened to live there. That every time he told someone I was staff instead of his stepdaughter, it reinforced that I didn't actually belong. The counselor asked if I'd told Richard this before. I said I'd tried, but he always brushed it off as me being too sensitive or taking jokes too seriously. Richard looked at me for the first time during the whole session and said he didn't realize the introductions were the core problem. He thought I was mad about doing chores. I told him the chores were never the issue. It was treated like staff while doing them. The counselor nodded and said this was an important breakthrough, that we were identifying the actual conflict instead of the surface symptoms. We had 2 more counseling sessions over the next 3 weeks. Richard slowly started understanding how his insecurity about his business and his role as stepfather had manifested as putting me down to make himself feel more successful. The counselor worked with him on better ways to handle those feelings. Mom talked about how she'd enabled the behavior by not confronting it directly and just quietly fixing things herself. I explained how the invoicing and refusing to help wasn't about the money. It was about forcing Richard to see what he was actually asking for and how he was asking for it. By the 3rd session, we were having actual conversations instead of arguments. Richard seemed different, less defensive, and more willing to listen. After that session ended, Richard asked if we could talk when we got home. Mom and I agreed. We drove back in separate cars and met in the living room. Richard handed me an envelope. Inside was a letter written in his handwriting, 3 pages long. He apologized for specific incidents, listing them out with details about how they must have felt from my perspective. Acknowledged that he'd been treating me like staff because it made him feel more successful and important. Said he understood now that it had damaged our relationship and made me feel unwelcome in my own home. The letter ended with him saying he wanted to do better and hoped I'd give him the chance to prove it. Tucked in the back was a check for $3,000. He'd written in the memo line that it was partial payment for work he never acknowledged properly. I looked up at him and he was watching me nervously. He said he knew money didn't fix everything, but he wanted to show he understood the value of what I'd been doing. Mom had tears in her eyes. I folded the letter carefully and told Richard I appreciated him writing it, that it meant more than he probably knew. I folded the check and tucked it into my wallet without depositing it. Mom watched me do this and asked why I wasn't cashing it right away. I told her I wanted to see if Richard actually meant what he wrote, or if this was just another performance. She nodded and said she understood, but asked me to give him a real chance to prove himself. I agreed, but kept the check in my wallet as a reminder of what he owed me beyond money. The next morning, I came downstairs to find Richard standing at the stove burning eggs. The kitchen smelled like scorched butter, and he was muttering to himself while scraping blackened pieces off the pan. He didn't ask me to take over or fix it. He just kept working at it until he had something vaguely resembling breakfast on his plate. Mom came down and looked surprised to see him cooking. Richard ate his burnt eggs without complaining and put his own dishes in the dishwasher. Over the next week, he kept doing his own tasks. His coffee was always too weak or too strong. His shirts came out of the dryer wrinkled because he forgot to move them right away. His lunch was usually a sad sandwich made with uneven bread slices. But he did it all himself without asking either of us for help. 2 weeks after the counseling sessions ended, Richard started doing his own laundry on Sundays. I walked past the laundry room and saw him reading the detergent bottle like it was written in a foreign language. He measured out way too much soap and the washing machine overflowed with bubbles. He spent 20 minutes cleaning up the mess and had to run the load again. His dress shirts came out pink because he didn't separate colors. Mom offered to help, but he said he needed to figure it out himself. The results were terrible, but the effort was obvious. He wore wrinkled clothes to work, and his breakfast was consistently mediocre, but he stopped treating the house like a hotel with staff. 3 weeks after our last counseling session, Richard told me he was having some friends over for poker and asked if that was okay. I said fine and went back to studying. That evening, his friends started arriving, and I stayed in my room working on a research paper. Around 8, I heard Richard calling people into the dining room. I came out to get water and found him introducing his poker buddies to Mom. When he saw me, he waved me over and told his friend this was his stepdaughter who was finishing her engineering degree. The friend, who Richard called Neville, shook my hand and said congratulations on my studies. Richard actually smiled when Neville asked what kind of engineering I was studying. He looked proud instead of embarrassed when I explained my research focus. Neville asked a few more questions about my thesis, and Richard stood there looking genuinely interested in my answers instead of trying to change the subject. I went back upstairs but found myself thinking about how different that introduction felt. An hour later, I came back down and started pulling ingredients out of the fridge. Mom asked what I was doing, and I told her I was making appetizers for Richard's poker night. She looked surprised and asked if he'd asked me to. I said no, but I wanted to help as a family thing, not because it was my job. I made stuffed mushrooms and bacon-wrapped dates, plated them nicely, and brought them to the dining room. Richard looked shocked when I set the food down. He thanked me 3 times in 2 minutes. When his friends complimented the food, Richard told them I was an amazing cook and made sure they knew I'd made everything. He gave me credit instead of acting like the food just appeared. One of his friends asked if I did catering, and Richard jumped in to say I was too busy with my graduate work, but that I'd been kind enough to help out tonight. The difference in how he talked about me was striking. After his friends left, Mom pulled me into the kitchen and told me Richard had been talking to his therapist about why he felt the need to put me down. She said the therapist helped him realize it connected to his own feelings about inheriting his business instead of building it himself. Richard apparently felt like a fraud sometimes because everything he had came from his father, and making me seem less accomplished made him feel more successful by comparison. Mom said he was working on dealing with those feelings in healthier ways. I told her I could see he was trying, and that meant something. She hugged me and said she was proud of both of us for working through this. The next week at the school, my teaching supervisor asked me to stay after our department meeting. She said I seemed less stressed lately and wanted to know if everything was okay at home. I explained that things had been rough for a while but were getting better. She nodded and said she'd noticed my work performance had been affected by whatever was going on. She mentioned I'd been short with students a few times and had missed some deadlines, which wasn't like me. I apologized and said I hadn't realized it was that obvious. She told me she was glad things were improving because she could see the difference in how I carried myself around campus. I left her office feeling embarrassed that my home stress had leaked into my professional life so visibly. 2 days later, Richard found me in the kitchen and asked if I'd be willing to help him prepare for another business dinner. Before I could answer, he quickly added that he'd either pay me the actual catering rate or I could say no without any guilt or pressure. He said he understood if I didn't want to help after everything that happened. I thought about it for a minute and told him I'd help his family, but I appreciated him asking properly this time. His face relaxed and he thanked me. He asked what I needed from him to make it easier, and actually wrote down my grocery list instead of expecting me to handle everything. He offered to do the shopping himself, but I said I'd go since I knew exactly what I needed. He handed me his credit card without making any comments about the cost. The business dinner happened on a Saturday evening. I spent the afternoon cooking while Richard set up the dining room and Mom arranged flowers. When guests started arriving, Richard introduced me to each person as his stepdaughter who was finishing her engineering degree. Several people asked about my research with actual interest instead of polite small talk. One woman asked detailed questions about my thesis and seemed genuinely impressed by my work. Another man said his company was always looking for engineers and asked if I'd be interested in interviewing after graduation. Richard stood nearby during these conversations looking proud instead of trying to redirect attention to himself. The dinner went smoothly and I helped serve food as myself, not as hired staff. Nobody tried to tip me. Nobody asked where Richard found his caterer. I was just part of the family hosting an event together. After dinner, I saw Richard talking quietly with one of his business partners near the fireplace. The man was someone I recognized from the disastrous anniversary party, someone Richard had introduced as his most important client. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but Richard looked serious, and the other man was nodding. Later, Mom told me the man had commented that the family situation seemed much better than last time. Richard apparently admitted he'd been handling things poorly and had to make some changes. The man respected that Richard owned up to it instead of making excuses. Mom said Richard seemed relieved that his business relationships weren't permanently damaged by how he'd acted before. The following Monday, I finally took Richard's check to the bank and deposited it. $3,000 went straight to my student loan payment, knocking down a chunk of my debt. That evening, Richard was looking at his bank statement on his laptop when I walked past his office. He glanced up at me, and I could see he'd noticed the check had cleared. He didn't say anything, but his shoulders relaxed and he gave me a small nod. I nodded back and kept walking. The money didn't fix everything, but accepting it felt like accepting his apology for real. We were both trying to move forward instead of staying stuck in how things used to be. A few weeks after the business dinner, Mom invited Reagan Wyatt over for dinner on a Friday night. Reagan worked in Mom's office and they'd been friends for years, but she hadn't been to the house in months. I was setting the table when she arrived and I heard her voice in the kitchen asking Mom if she needed help with anything. Mom told her everything was under control, and when Reagan walked into the dining room, she stopped and stared at Richard standing at the stove stirring a pot of pasta sauce. He was wearing an apron and actually looked focused on what he was doing instead of just going through the motions. Reagan looked at me, then back at Richard, then at Mom, who was chopping vegetables next to him. She asked if Richard was really cooking, and Mom laughed and said we'd been working on family dynamics, and everyone was contributing more equally now. Reagan sat down at the table and watched Richard drain the pasta without burning himself or making a mess. She told Mom the change was obvious and seemed really positive, and I could tell she meant it, because Reagan never bothered with polite lies. During dinner, Richard asked Reagan about her work, and actually listened to her answers instead of waiting for a chance to talk about himself. After Reagan left, Mom squeezed my hand and said she was glad other people could see how much better things had gotten. My graduate research presentation was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon in the engineering building's main lecture hall. I'd been working on my thesis for 2 years, and this presentation was a big deal because several professors from other departments would be attending along with some industry professionals looking for potential hires. I was nervous setting up my slides and adjusting the microphone when I saw Mom walk in and take a seat in the third row. Then Richard came in behind her, wearing a suit like he'd come straight from one of his stores. He sat down next to Mom and pulled out a small notebook and pen. I almost messed up my opening because I was so surprised to see him there. I'd mentioned the presentation once at dinner but hadn't expected him to actually show up. The presentation lasted 40 minutes and covered my research on optimizing supply chain logistics using machine learning algorithms. It was technical and detailed with lots of data and complex charts. When I finished, the professors asked questions and I could see Richard in the audience actually taking notes instead of checking his phone or looking bored. After everyone left, Richard came up to me and said he had no idea how complex my work was. He looked embarrassed and admitted he felt stupid for dismissing it as just studying all these years. Mom hugged me and said she was proud, and Richard nodded and said he was too. 2 weeks later, I got an email inviting me to present my research at a conference in Chicago. It was a big opportunity because companies would be recruiting there, and having a presentation on my resume would help with job applications. The registration fee was $300, and the hotel would cost another $400 for 3 nights. I was trying to figure out if I could afford it when Richard knocked on my bedroom door and asked if he could come in. He sat on my desk chair and asked about the conference, and I explained what it was and why it mattered for my career. Richard pulled out his wallet and handed me his credit card. He said to book the flight and hotel and register for the conference, and he'd cover all of it as an investment in my career. I asked if he was sure because it would probably cost over $1,000 total. He said he was sure, and that this was the kind of thing parents should do to support their kids' professional development. I took the card and booked everything that night, and when I gave the card back the next morning, Richard asked me to send him the conference schedule so he'd know when I was presenting. The following week, my grad school friend Carly Romero came over to work on a group project for our advanced systems class. We had to build a working prototype, and my house had more space and better tools than either of our apartments. I warned Carly that my stepdad would be home, but he'd probably stay out of our way. When Richard got home from work, he came into the living room where we had papers and circuit boards spread across the coffee table. He introduced himself to Carly and asked what we were working on. Carly explained the project, and Richard actually seemed interested instead of just being polite. He offered us the dining room table so we'd have more space to spread out our materials. He helped us carry everything to the dining room and asked if we needed anything like drinks or snacks. Carly looked at me with raised eyebrows after Richard left the room. She whispered that my stepdad seemed really nice and supportive, nothing like how I'd described him before. I told her things had changed a lot in the past few months. A few days after Carly's visit, Richard asked if I had time to talk about something work-related. We sat in his home office and he pulled up a spreadsheet showing inventory data from his hardware stores. He said he'd been thinking about what I'd said at my research presentation about optimization algorithms and wondered if my engineering background might offer useful insights for his business. He showed me how they currently tracked inventory manually and how often they ran out of popular items or over-ordered things that didn't sell. I looked at his system and immediately saw several inefficiencies. We spent 2 hours talking about how he could use simple software to predict demand based on historical sales data and seasonal patterns. Richard took detailed notes and asked smart questions about implementation costs and training requirements. He thanked me for my time and said my suggestions made a lot of sense. 5 months passed and I was deep into writing my thesis when Richard asked me to meet him at one of his stores. When I got there, he walked me through the back warehouse and showed me the new inventory system they'd implemented based on my suggestions. Everything was digital now, with tablets mounted on the walls, showing real-time stock levels and automatic reorder triggers. Richard said they'd saved over $30,000 in the first quarter by reducing waste and avoiding stockouts. His regional manager was there, and Richard introduced me as the person who designed the efficiency improvements. The manager shook my hand and said my system was working better than the expensive consultant they'd hired 2 years ago. Richard asked if I'd be interested in doing occasional consulting work for his business at a fair hourly rate. He said having a genuine professional relationship separate from our family dynamic might actually be healthier than the unclear expectations we'd had before. I agreed, and we set up a formal consulting arrangement where I'd review their systems quarterly and suggest improvements. The hourly rate he offered was generous and would help pay down my student loans faster. The consulting arrangement started the following month, and I spent about 5 hours reviewing data and writing up recommendations. Richard paid me promptly through his business account with a proper invoice and everything. It felt completely different from the old dynamic where he'd expect work without acknowledgement. Now, when I helped with his business, it was a clear transaction with defined scope and fair compensation. When I helped with family stuff like cooking dinner, it was because I wanted to, not because I was expected to as some kind of rent payment. Mom noticed the difference too and commented that we'd finally figured out how to separate professional help from family contributions. One evening, Mom and I were doing dishes together while Richard was on a work call in his office. Mom told me she was proud of how I'd stood up for myself and set boundaries with Richard. She admitted she should have done the same thing years ago instead of quietly compensating for his behavior. She said she'd enabled him by just doing extra work herself, rather than confronting him directly about how he treated me. I asked why she hadn't said something sooner, and she explained that she'd been worried about causing conflict in the marriage. But watching me refuse to accept being treated like staff had shown her that setting boundaries didn't destroy relationships. It actually made them healthier. She said our family dynamic was better now than it had been in years, because everyone knew where they stood and what was expected. Richard's brother Alvaro Garcia came to visit in early spring. I hadn't seen him since that Thanksgiving when Richard told him I was between jobs and earning my keep through housework. Alvaro stayed for dinner, and I could see him watching Richard help Mom cook and clean up afterward. After dinner, Alvaro told Richard he seemed different lately, less stressed and more genuine. Richard credited the family counseling and admitted he'd been creating unnecessary tension by trying to appear more successful than he actually felt. He said he'd been so worried about looking like he had everything under control that he'd made everyone around him miserable. Alvaro said he could tell things were better, and that Richard seemed more comfortable in his own skin now. My thesis defense was in late April, and 2 weeks after that, I got a job offer from an engineering firm 2 hours away. The position was exactly what I wanted, working on supply chain optimization for manufacturing companies. The salary was good, and they offered full benefits with relocation assistance. I'd finally be moving out and starting my actual career instead of just preparing for it. I told Mom and Richard at dinner that night, and Mom's eyes filled with tears even though she was smiling. Richard's reaction surprised me because instead of making some comment about finally getting his house back, he asked questions about the company and the role. He wanted to know about the commute and whether I'd looked at apartments yet. When I said I hadn't started apartment hunting, he offered to help me look at places the following weekend. He pulled up a map on his phone and started researching neighborhoods near my new office, pointing out areas with good transit access and reasonable rent prices. That weekend, Richard drove us around to look at apartments near my new job. He pointed out grocery stores and gas stations in each neighborhood, mentioned which areas had bad traffic during rush hour, and checked crime statistics on his phone while we sat in parking lots. He asked about my commute preferences and whether I wanted to be closer to work or closer to the highway that led back home. When I found a one-bedroom apartment with good light and updated appliances, Richard walked through it like he was inspecting one of his stores, checking water pressure and testing cabinet hinges. He suggested I negotiate the rent down because the carpet in the bedroom looked worn, and he was right because the landlord dropped it by $50 a month. Mom took pictures of each apartment so I could compare them later, and Richard made a spreadsheet ranking them by cost, commute time, and neighborhood safety. He treated the whole process like helping his kid make a smart decision, instead of just getting me out of his house. When I signed the lease 2 weeks later, Richard offered to co-sign even though I had good credit and steady income, saying it might help with approval. I didn't need him to, but I appreciated that he wanted to support me in a real way. My graduation ceremony happened on a Saturday morning in May, with hundreds of other students walking across the stage in the university auditorium. I spotted Mom and Richard in the third row as soon as I entered with my department, both of them dressed up and holding their phones ready to take pictures. When they called my name for my master's degree in engineering, Richard stood up and cheered loud enough that people around him turned to look. Mom was crying happy tears and waving, and I felt genuinely proud instead of worried about what Richard might say to people later. After the ceremony, Richard found me outside and hugged me, telling me he was proud of me and that the degree was a huge accomplishment. His business partner from the hardware stores was there with his daughter who was also graduating, and Richard introduced me as his stepdaughter who just earned her master's in engineering. He said it with obvious pride in his voice, making sure his colleague knew exactly what I'd achieved. The man congratulated me and asked about my job offer, and Richard jumped in to brag about the engineering firm that hired me and how competitive the position was. I could tell he genuinely felt proud instead of embarrassed or dismissive like he used to be. 2 weeks after graduation, Richard threw a party at the house specifically for me. He invited his business associates, some of Mom's coworkers, my grad school friends and family members. He set up a table with my thesis research displayed and printed copies of my job offer letter to show people. When guests arrived, Richard introduced me as his stepdaughter who just completed her master's degree and landed a great engineering position 2 hours away. He walked people over to the research table and pointed out my work, asking me to explain the supply chain optimization project to anyone who seemed interested. He made sure I was the center of attention instead of using my event to talk about himself and his business. Several of his hardware store partners congratulated me and asked questions about my new job, and Richard stood nearby looking genuinely happy about my success. Mom told me later that Richard had been planning the party for weeks, making sure everything focused on celebrating my accomplishments instead of treating it like another business networking event. Garrison and his wife showed up halfway through the party, bringing a card with a generous gift certificate inside. His wife congratulated me warmly and said she remembered meeting me before, though her expression suggested she remembered the awkward circumstances. She mentioned that Richard talks about me completely differently now, with obvious respect and affection in his voice. Garrison shook my hand and said he'd heard great things about my research and new position, and I could tell Richard had been talking me up to his business partners instead of downplaying my achievements. Richard joined our conversation and started telling them about my thesis defense, describing how impressed the faculty committee had been with my work. He asked if I'd told them about the consulting work I'd been doing for his stores, framing it as professional collaboration instead of household duties. Garrison seemed genuinely interested and asked if I'd consider doing similar work for other businesses once I was settled in my new job. Richard looked pleased that his business partner respected my expertise, and the whole interaction felt completely different from the dinner party where Garrison had tried to tip me as hired help. The next day, I gave Richard and Mom a framed photo from my graduation ceremony, showing the three of us together after I received my degree. Mom hugged me and said she'd put it on her dresser, but Richard asked if he could keep it for his office at work. He said he wanted his employees and business associates to see it when they came in for meetings. I told him that was fine, appreciating that he wanted to display my accomplishment prominently instead of hiding the fact that he had a stepdaughter still figuring out her career. Richard actually got a little emotional and thanked me for sticking with the family through the rough patches, admitting he'd made things harder than they needed to be. Mom squeezed both our hands and said she was proud of how we'd worked through our problems instead of just staying angry at each other. 2 weeks before my move, Richard asked if we could set up regular family dinners after I left, maybe monthly at a restaurant halfway between our locations. He said he didn't want me to feel like moving out meant losing touch with the family, and he wanted to stay connected to my life and career. I agreed, surprised that he was thinking about maintaining our relationship instead of just being relieved I was leaving. He pulled up a map and showed me a few restaurant options in towns that split the distance, asking which type of food I preferred. We settled on the first Sunday of each month, which would give us all time to adjust to the new routine without it feeling forced. Mom seemed happy that Richard was making the effort, and I felt like maybe we'd actually figured out how to be a functional family instead of just people living in the same house with unclear expectations. Moving day came on a hot Saturday in June, and Richard took the entire day off work to help me load furniture and boxes into a rented truck. He showed up in old clothes ready to work, carrying tools and packing supplies he'd brought from one of his hardware stores. He lifted heavy furniture without complaining, wrapped my dishes carefully in newspaper, and made sure everything was secured properly in the truck for the 2-hour drive. When we got to my new apartment, he helped carry everything up 3 flights of stairs, sweating through his shirt but staying focused on getting me settled. He assembled my bed frame and bookshelf, hung curtain rods, and installed a new lock on my door because he said the existing one looked cheap. Mom brought lunch for everyone, and we ate sitting on boxes in my empty living room, all of us tired but satisfied with the progress. Richard seemed genuinely invested in making sure my apartment was safe and comfortable, treating the whole day like a parent helping their kid with a major life transition, instead of just fulfilling an obligation. After everything was moved in and mostly unpacked, Richard handed me an envelope before he and Mom left to drive home. Inside was a check for $5,000 with a note saying it was a housewarming gift to help me get started with furniture and supplies. I tried to give it back, saying it was too much, but Richard insisted I keep it. He said he knew starting out in a new city with a new job was expensive, and he wanted to help me build a good foundation. I accepted it gratefully, understanding that this came from a completely different place than his earlier attempts to pay me for household work. This wasn't about treating me like staff or trying to make up for bad behavior with money. This was him supporting me the way parents support their adult children when they're launching their careers. Mom hugged me goodbye and told me to call if I needed anything, and Richard said the same thing, reminding me about our monthly dinner plan. 2 weeks after I moved out, Mom and Richard visited my apartment on a Sunday afternoon, bringing takeout food and a bag of kitchen supplies I'd forgotten. Richard helped me hang pictures on the walls, measuring carefully and using a level to make sure everything was straight. Mom organized my pantry and showed me the grocery stores she'd researched nearby. We ate dinner sitting at my small kitchen table, and Richard joked that he was available for future furniture assembly at family rates. We all laughed because the dynamic had completely changed from when I was living at home. Richard asked about my new job and listened to my stories about learning the company systems and meeting my coworkers. He offered advice based on his own business experience, but framed it as suggestions instead of instructions. Mom talked about changes at her work, and Richard mentioned he'd implemented another one of my efficiency suggestions at his stores. The whole visit felt comfortable and genuine instead of tense and performative like family gatherings used to be. 3 months into my new job, I was thriving professionally, working on complex supply chain projects and getting positive feedback from my managers. My relationship with Richard had settled into something better than it had ever been when I lived at home. We met for dinner on the first Sunday of each month at a restaurant halfway between our locations, and Richard always asked about my work with genuine interest. He wanted to know about the projects I was managing, the clients I was working with, and the technical challenges I was solving. He treated me like a professional equal instead of a kid he was stuck supporting, and I could tell he respected my expertise in ways he never had before. Mom was happier too because the tension that used to fill the house was gone, replaced by actual family connection built on mutual respect. Our family wasn't perfect, and we still had moments of frustration with each other, but everything was built on clear expectations and honest communication instead of resentment and unclear roles. I'd learned that sometimes you have to demand respect before people realize you deserve it, and that setting boundaries doesn't destroy relationships, but actually makes them healthier and stronger.